Hello friends, good morning and welcome to the EduSat Network. Our topic of discussion today is part of our ongoing subject on film studies, and today's specific topic is Hindi parallel cinema. Today shall be part 1 of the same, and for this very lecture we have with us in our studio our subject expert Dr. Manoj Sharma, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Kirodimal College, University of Delhi. With this I welcome sir and also request him to begin our today's lecture. Hello sir.
A very good morning to all the viewers. Today's topic of discussion is Hindi parallel cinema. What we have seen is that Hindi cinema is quite popular not only in the Hindi speaking regions of our country, but Hindi film songs, they are being heard in every part of our nation or country where Hindi is also not quite spoken by the inhabitants. And at the same time, Hindi cinema or the popular Hindi cinema is quite popular in other regions of the world where Indian diaspora is there. So what we see is that Hindi parallel cinema was based on certain conventions which were not in line with the mainstream or the popular cinema. And Hindi parallel cinema had also origins in 1940s and 50s when we see that some of the films which were issue based in nature, which were dealing with the socio-political climate of the country, they were being made. So in this sense, the way Hindi parallel cinema got reflected in late 60s and 70s was in a way reflection of 1940s and 50s film. And many of the filmmakers, those who were associated with the parallel cinema, they made initially films in Bengali like Satyajit Rai, Ritwik Ghatak, Manal Sen, etc. Those who were associated with this movement of parallel cinema, they made films in Bengali language, and later some of the Hindi filmmakers, those who made films like Shyam Benegal, etc., those who started making films in 70s and thereafter. So this kind of distinction which we see generally, that Hindi parallel cinema and the art cinema, which are considered to be the same set of films which are the art cinema or the parallel cinema, and they are in a way different from the commercial or the popular cinema. So commercial cinema or the popular cinema, which is the mainstream cinema, how it is different from the art cinema or the parallel cinema. The kind of conventions which were being established or framed in 1940s when there was a decline of the studio system and there was an emergence of the star system with the arrival of lot of black money during the Second World War. And with that arrival of black money, the people, those who were earning that kind of money, they hired the film stars or the film technicians, and that led to the decline of the studio system. And when the star system came in 1940s, what we see, there was an emergence of a lot of commercial films as well. Kismat was one of the biggest blockbusters in 1943, and in which you see the arrival of Ashok Kumar as a big star. He had also acted in earlier films also. Achut Kanya was his first film in 1936. So what we see is that these kind of conventions which were there in the popular cinema, in which we see a lot of song and dance, a lot of melodrama, a lot of cliche and stereotyping of characters which was seen. So parallel cinema was in opposition to this kind of cinema. It was trying to give some kind of meaning to the cinematic language, and these kind of films, they were comparatively more serious in nature. The kind of content which was there, which was more social and political in nature, and in this way it was trying to redefine the Hindi films. So what we see is that these kind of distinctions which are being made vis-a-vis parallel cinema and the commercial cinema, they are there in the Hindi cinema. So what you can see on the slide is that how commercial, mainstream and popular cinema, they have been categorized as one kind of cinema, and the other cinema which is considered to be the art cinema or the parallel cinema is considered to be some sort of a serious artistic work which was considered to be experimental in nature, and it was not designed for mass appeal. So what we see is that these kind of films are made even now especially after the liberalization of the Indian economy, that we have seen a lot of experimentation, and the distinction between the art cinema and the commercial cinema has got very narrower, because what we see is that a number of films which are commercial in nature, they have a lot of aesthetic sense, a lot of inputs which are considered to be very artistic in nature. So, this kind of distinction has become narrower in the recent times, and a number of filmmakers, those who are associated with the commercial filmmaking, they are giving a lot of input in that context as well. Another important thing which is associated with the parallel cinema or the art cinema is the serious content. The serious content in the context that the popular song and dance sequences, the popular storyline in which you could even predict that what kind of changes will come in the story, they were generally not repeated in the parallel cinema, and a lot of focus was taken from realism and naturalism, which were the movements in the literary field. So, realism was a movement and naturalism was a movement in literature, and how these movements which were dealing with some kind of projection of reality, they were being adapted to suit the cinematic needs. So, these kind of changes which we see in the films of 1920s as well. There was a film called Savkari Pash which was made by V. Shantaram. It was a silent film, and this is considered to be one of the first realist films of India. And thereafter we see a number of films as well which were made by V. Shantaram and others which were dealing with these kind of ideas. So, these films, they were dealing with the socio-political themes, or the nature of the themes were socio-political in nature, that how society in a way was dealing with these kind of issues, and they were also trying to reject the various dance and song sequences which were found in earlier films. Some of the precursors which we can see, a number of films which could be seen as some sort of a precursors, were Udair Pathe or Hamrahi, which was made in 1945 by Bimal Roy. Udair Pathe was in Bengali in 1944, and then Hamrahi, which was made in 1945 with the same theme. So, these films, they were considered to be in a way some sort of a break from the earlier song and dance sequences. At the same time, Dharti Ke Lal, which was a film which was made in 1946 by K. Abbas, which was dealing with the Bengal famine of 1943. And this film was quite stark and realistic in nature, and it also trying to reject some kind of earlier narratives of Hindi cinema, in which you had all those kinds of conventions which were being followed in the Hindi cinema. Another important film was Neecha Nagar, which was made in 1946 by Chetan Anand, and Neecha Nagar was talking about, it was giving some sort of a socialist message. It was also associated with social realism as well. And this film was talking about the class conflict, that how there was a conflict of the classes, how the upper classes and the lower classes, there were some kind of distinctions between them, and how these kind of distinctions, they were being projected on the celluloid. So, these kind of images which were shown on the Indian screen, they were quite new to the Indian audience. They had not seen such kind of images earlier. And what we see is that Dharti Ke Lal was a venture of IPTA, Indian People's Theatres Association, which was the cultural wing of Communist Party of India. So, it was making some sort of a political statement as well. So, how the social ideas they got reflected in various films, and it was also relevant to the political climate of the country, in which the colonialism in the form which we have seen, that how Britishers, they exploited the Indian nation or the Indian country, and how the Bengal famine, which was a result of the evil machinations, how the Bengal famine was not a natural famine, but rather a man-made famine, in which the Britishers, they were trying to export, or they exported the Indian food grains, not keeping in mind how Indian people, they will adapt to that kind of situation. And another film which was dealing with this kind of theme was Chhinnamool, again a Bengali film which was made in 1948 by Nabendu Ghosh, and it was dealing with the trauma of partition. And this film, Chinnamool was also very realistic in nature, in which we see that how Ritwik Ghatak, who was also associated with IPTA and who also later became one of the teachers at Film and Television Institute of India, FTII, he also acted in this film. And later Ghatak made a number of films as well. He was also associated with the new kind of cinema which was made in 1950s and which got a lot of fame with the arrival of Satyajit Rai's Pathir Panchali. So what we see is that even Satyajit Rai, he acknowledged that the cinema of Ritwik Ghatak, which was a film which he made, which came earlier than Pathir Panchali, which was not allowed to be released and which was later released in 1970s. So that kind of cinema which was made in 1950s could be some sort of a precursor to the films which were made in late 60s and 70s. In terms of origins, when we see the parallel cinema, we can say that in 1950s this cinema was more dominant, and it was an alternative to the mainstream commercial cinema or the commercial Hindi cinema which we have seen. And this cinema was also inspired by the Italian neorealism. Italian neorealism, which came in Italy in 1940s and early 50s. And Italian neorealism, we find that some of the characteristics that they were using non-professional actors in their films. What we find is that non-professional actors, they were being used, and at the same time what we see is that it was against the white telephone films. White telephone films were those films which were made in which were glossy in nature, in which you will find characters, they were talking to each other on white telephones, and these films were commercial in nature. So Italian neorealism was in response to those white telephone films which were glossy in nature, which were very extravagant, and which was showing some sort of an Italy which was quite happy, which was quite prosperous. And neorealism was trying to present reality in a different way. It was trying to bring reality in a meaningful and purposeful way. It was trying to project reality that how the conditions in Italy were not all that rosy, they were not all that happy. There was a lot of poverty, there was a lot of unemployment. Italy was facing a lot of problems during the fascist rule. So the white telephone films which were commercial in nature, they were being rejected by the neorealist cinema, and some of the filmmakers, those who were associated with the neorealist films like Roberto Rossellini, Visconti and De Sica, they played an important role in projecting this kind of reality. And at the same time, there was in late 1950s, there was the French New Wave which we have seen. And Indian cinema was also influenced by the Italian neorealism and the French New Wave. And the Indian cinema could be seen, the films in Indian cinema or the Hindi cinema which were made in 1950s and in mid 40s could be seen in the context of the way the new wave cinema of 1950s was made. So in the context of neorealism, neorealism was some sort of a movement in Italian cinema, and it was also against the fascist propaganda, and it was talking about a cinema which was meaningful and purposeful in nature, and the kind of fascist propaganda in which Italy was shown to be a center where all kinds of prosperity was there, was rejected by neorealist cinema. The neorealist filmmakers like Roberto Rossellini, who made a film called Rome Open City or Roma Città Aperta in 1945, and he also made a film called Paisa or Neighbor. And what we have seen is that in his films, he was also using some sort of documentary footage of the war times. So what we see is that he was trying to incorporate that documentary footage as he did in Neighbor or Paisa, which he made, in which a number of episodes they came together and they made a film. So, another filmmaker called Vittorio De Sica, who made a film called Ladri di Bicicletta, or The Bicycle Thieves, which was made in 1948. So, Bicycle Thieves was one film which also influenced another film called Do Biga Zameen, which was made in 1953. So, when you see both the films together, you will find that there is a lot of resemblance in both the films, and Bimal Roy, who had seen this film Bicycle Thieves in the International Film Festival, which was organized in India in 1950s, early part of 50s, specifically 1951, and how he got influenced by seeing that kind of cinema. And later when he made this film called Do Biga Zameen, and this film was internationally acclaimed and in various quarters, and it was compared with the De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, which is considered to be the neorealist masterpiece. Another film called La Terra Trema by Visconti. Visconti was another filmmaker who was associated with making films on neorealism, and La Terra Trema or The Earth Trembles, this film, when it was made and it was seen by the audience, because the people, those who were the characters in the film, they were taken from the local areas. Many a times they were not the professional actors, rather they were non-professional in nature. The kind of dialogues which were arrived at, they were devised on the sets. They were not largely written from that perspective, they were not contrived in that sense, they were trying to be more spontaneous in nature. Most of the shooting was on location shooting was done for these kind of films, so that some kind of authenticity in terms of characters could be seen. A number of Indian filmmakers, they were also influenced by the foreign filmmakers, like what we have seen is Satyajit Rai, Ritwik Ghatak and Mrinal Sen from Bengal, those who were important filmmakers in 1950s and thereafter, and how these filmmakers, they were also internationally acclaimed filmmakers they became, and how in Hindi cinema we see that Manikal, Kumar Sahani, Shyam Benegal, etc., how they were influenced and how they made certain films in late 60s and 70s which became important from the context of the parallel cinema, that how parallel cinema emerged out of the films which were made by these filmmakers. In the context of Satyajit Rai, he was associated with advertising initially in his career, and how he was also influenced by Italian neorealism. He acknowledges that he was highly influenced by De Sica's film Bicycle Thieves, and he had a lot of influence of Renoir also, Jean Renoir. He also assisted him when he came to India, and at the same time when he was making this film called Pather Panchali, he had limited finances, he did not have much money so that he could produce and direct that film, and during the filming of the film he ran short of money, and he had to sell ornaments of his wife also, and later he had to borrow money from the government of West Bengal also. And when he was assisted by the government of West Bengal in his venture, this film was applauded or appreciated across the world, and Satyajit Rai is considered to be top 10 filmmakers of the world of all time, and he has received his films, they have received international awards, they not only at the national level but at the international level also, international awards, national awards, and how Satyajit Rai or his style of making films got popular in 1950s and thereafter, and his cinema was seen as some sort of an alternative cinema or parallel cinema to the commercial filmmaking, which was largely concentrated in Bombay and also in South India or the Tamil cinema. So, the way he got finances from the Bengal government, and how his Apu trilogy, it also became quite popular. The three films which Satyajit Rai made during this particular period, Pather Panchali, Aparajito and Apur Sansar, and all these films they were appreciated at the international level. How international audience they appreciated the cinema which was made by Satyajit Rai, in which there was a film called Pather Panchali, the song of the little road, as you can see on the screen, and this film was made in 1955, and this film became quite popular, and the film had some sort of a lyrical quality. This film was also criticized on the ground that film was trying to show a decline of a certain class, but at the same time Ray also acknowledges this fact that he was trying to show that a class which was earlier quite affluent, it was in decline. And a number of people, they criticized Satyajit Rai on the ground that Satyajit Rai was trying to sell Indian poverty to the Western audience, because the film was dealing with Indian poverty. So Indian poverty, the way it was being shown in the film, and Satyajit Rai was trying to sell that Indian poverty to the Western audience, and this charge was later rejected by so many people, those who were associated with the film world, as well as when Jawaharlal Nehru, who saw a film, he did not find that such kind of a charge could be applied to a film called Pather Panchali, and it was not accepted at official level. But though Ray was criticized on these grounds, the way Satyajit Rai was honored at the international level, the kind of awards which came to him could be seen, was not only an indicator that how Ray excelled, they just are some sort of a pointer which provide us this kind of an idea that how important as a filmmaker Ray was. What we see is that, as you can see on the screen as well, that Dada Saheb Phalke award was given to him in 1985. Satyajit Rai Dada Saheb Phalke award is the highest award which is given to the filmmakers, and he was given Legion of Honor by the President of France in 1987, and Government of India awarded the highest civilian honor Bharat Ratna to Satyajit Rai, and he was also awarded the Oscars for the lifetime achievement in 1992 by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and posthumously he was also awarded Akira Kurosawa Award for lifetime achievement. So what we see is that Satyajit Rai was not known nationally, but he was known internationally. Various awards which I have talked about, they are largely international in nature, and at the same time they are awards of the highest nature. We are not talking about the awards which his films they won at international level, because all his films more or less they won awards and at different platforms across the world, not only in India but across the world. So the kind of apogee or the kind of appreciation which Satyajit Rai received at various quarters at different levels, nationally and internationally, these awards were some sort of a reflection to the work which Satyajit Rai did. Another important filmmaker which I would like to talk about is Ritwik Ghatak, who was a member of IPTA, Indian People's Theatres Association, and in IPTA was the cultural wing of CPI, as I have told you earlier as well. And in his film what we see is the pain of partition. The pain of partition is reflected in the films which were made by Ritwik Ghatak. Ritwik Ghatak, he had to migrate to West Bengal from East Bengal, which is now Bangladesh, and this kind of separation from his homeland is reflected in the cinema which was made by Ritwik Ghatak. His trilogy Meghadak Tara, Komal Gandhar and Subarna Rekha, all the three films which are considered to be a trilogy which he made, these films they try to project not only the kind of rootlessness which he could see, the kind of pain of partition could be seen in this kind of cinema, and partition for him was not some sort of a political divide between India and Pakistan, but some sort of a cultural uprooting which could be seen in his cinema. The way the people they got displaced from their homelands, how they had to migrate from one area to another, and how this kind of political separation this kind of political separation forced the people to in a way migrate from one area to another, but at the same time culturally also how these people they became refugees in their homelands, because the people those who migrated from the regions of Karachi and Lahore to Delhi and Amritsar, they became refugees overnight. The people those who migrated from Delhi and Amritsar and from other parts of India to Lahore and Karachi and other parts of Pakistan, they also became refugees. So this kind of trauma of being called a refugee in their own homelands, this kind of trauma in which their culture that suffered, that was reflected in films of Ritwik Ghatak, as he personally experienced this kind of trauma. And he also sees that the economic decline of Bengal due to partition, that how Bengal it also declined, the kind of economy, the economy saw the decline, it was also as a result of partition, the kind of disruption of the life of the masses during the times of partition, and how partition not only remained as some sort of a political statement, rather it was some sort of a personal experience of the masses. And not only Ritwik Ghatak, but later Gulzar, Sham Benegal, etc., Bhisham Sahani who wrote Tamas, which was also linked to this theme. So how these people they experienced partition as some sort of a personal experience, and how some of the people like Urvashi Butalia who has written the partition history with the kind of interviews taken from the people those who were the victims of partition. So the way history has been rewritten through the interview, and how the personal experiences of the people those who witnessed partition has been some sort of a personal history, and how this personal history is related to the larger history of the country. Another important filmmaker which we have talked about is Ritwik Ghatak, and another important filmmaker which we are going to talk about is Mrinal Sen, who was born in 1923. And Mrinal Sen was also a very committed filmmaker, as we have seen that his work spans around 50 to 60 years of filmmaking, and he was also associated with IPTA, the Indian People's Theatres Association, and many of the films which he made were overtly political in nature as well. And what we see is that the films which were made by Mrinal Sen, many a times they do not provide you a happy ending or a definitive conclusion, which we see in other parallel cinema films as well, that the audience which is watching the films, it becomes part of the process in which the kind of conclusion is to be achieved at. So these films many a times they are open ended in nature, there is no definitive kind of conclusion provided to the audience, and it is up to the audience to decide that what kind of what kind of conclusion should be there in the film. Mrinal Sen was also awarded at his films, they got awards at not only national level but international level as well, and how he was awarded by the Indian government, how his films they were appreciated by the audience, that also forms part of the narrative in which Mrinal Sen made the films. What we see is that he was given Padma Bhushan in 1981 by the government of India in the recognition of the various films which he made. As you can see on the screen, the kind of awards or honors which were being given to Mrinal Sen. In 1985, he got the award of Commander of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French government, and this kind of award, it is the highest civilian honor which is given by the French government to the contribution which is made in arts, literature or propagation of these kind of fields. He also got Dada Saheb Phalke Award in 2003. He was made the honorary member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, and Lifetime Achievement Award at 10th edition of Ocean Cinefest Film Festival in 2008. So, what we see is that the various films of Mrinal Sen which have been made in a large span of years from 1950s onwards, and how they were being appreciated at national and international level, how he was made a member of juries at various international film festivals. It was some sort of a recognition of the kind of work which was done by Mrinal Sen, and how he was made a member of the various juries at international level. And the film which he made in 1969, the Hindi film called Bhuvan Shom. Bhuvan Shom was a film which was made in 1969, in which Utpal Dutt was the protagonist of the film. Bhuvan Shom means Mr. Shom, and how the film revolves around that railway official, and how over a period of time he realizes some sort of a self-realization takes place in the film. So, this film was considered to be some sort of a film which was the first film in Hindi which was dealing with the new wave cinema in 1960s, which started with 1960s with Bhuvan Shom. So, the film deals with the self-realization of the protagonist, and thereafter we see a number of films which were made in 1970s which were dealing with these kind of ideas. Government was making a lot of efforts also in the context that S.K. Patil Committee, it was instituted in 1949, and S.K. Patil Committee gave certain recommendations. It was critical of the way the film industry was operating, and the kind of organization, finance, selection, and the handling of themes, and the availability of the trained personnels, its conduct and supply of goods and service. So, all these areas, they were taken up by the Film Enquiry Committee in 1949, and they submitted a report in 1951, and also recommended that certain measures should be initiated so that the condition of the Indian film industry could be improved. So, the committee recommended that a film finance corporation, so that could be started, so it could give the chief finance to the filmmakers, and an institution could be created to train actors and technicians. So, what we see is that committee was recommending that a film finance corporation should be introduced, because what we have seen is that Satyajit Rai, he had a lot of problems while filming Pathir Panchali, because he could not find finance. And after that, what we see is that government takes a lot of initiative, and it starts a body which was there to provide finance to the budding filmmakers, or filmmakers those who have those kind of themes in which some kind of social comment could be made upon. So, these kind of films, they were being financed by the government, they were being given some kind of money or purse by the government, so that these kind of filmmakers, they could also make those films which are quite relevant for the society. At the same time, the committee also recommended that the national film honors or awards, they should also be instituted, and later they was also started as well, that national film awards, they were being given, and the awards, they were being instituted in 1953. The committee also suggested that Central Board of Film Censors should also be instituted, and in 1952 CBFC was set up in Bombay. The headquarters were in Bombay, and the regional offices were in Madras and Calcutta. So, as you can see on the screen as well, that these kind of recommendations which were being given by the S.K. Patil Committee was to bring some kind of uniformity in terms of working of the censors, and at the same time it was also asking that some institutes or institutions should also be established, so that these kind of institutions can play an important role in terms of growth of Indian film industry. And these kind of institutions, they were established also in 1960. What we see is that government was making a lot of efforts, and Film Finance Corporation was established by the government in 1960s, and at the same time Film Institute was also started in Pune in 1961. The Film Institute was initially concerned with films only, and later TV was also added to it. So it became FTII, Film and Television Institute of India, and it was trying to cater to the people, those who wanted to associate themselves with the film industry. It was offering a number of streams in which in terms of acting, editing, direction, etc., where these people could be trained, and with that kind of training they could go to actual film medium. So it was quite imperative when they will go from when they will go being trained at an institute, and when they will go to the medium directly. So they will have some kind of experience at one level, and that at the other level they will be able to excel, because they already had these kind of interactions at their teaching level. So this was done by the government, as well as the Film Archives, National Film Archives of India, NFAI, was also established in 1960s. And the task of National Film Archives of India was to preserve and restore the various films which were made during the earlier part, and at the same time to access and restore these kind of films which were there, which were languishing in different parts of the country. They were not being preserved, and at the same time the print material which was also associated with the film, that was also to be kept in a library. So the National Film Archives of India has a library and has a lab in which the films they are being preserved, as well as the material which is associated with the film medium is also in a way housed in the library. So these kind of efforts, they were being made by the government in 1960s so that film medium could prosper. And these institutions, they also became some sort of a training ground for the budding filmmakers, and the Directorate of Film Festivals was also set up to organize an annual international film festival. So what we see is that when these kind of measures, they were being undertaken by the government at different levels, the kind of funding which the government had, the kind of funding which was provided by the government to these kind of institutes and institutions, it became easier for the people to come and research in these areas, especially National Film Archives of India. And at the same time, the people, those who wanted to associate themselves with the film medium, they also got some kind of training at at the Film and Television Institute of India, or FTII, and a number of film personalities they got associated, like Jaya Bhaduri, for example, who studied Nasiruddin Shah, etc., those who were associated with the National School of Drama, NSD, and how people from NSD, they also came into the film medium. So the efforts at the government level in which they were establishing institutions like FTII, NSD, etc., and how the people, those who were associated with these kind of institutions, and when they came to the medium of films, they were able to provide some sort of a better perspective, better idea, and better contribution to the film industry. What also we see is that how government was providing finance to some of the independent filmmakers as well. Some of the independent filmmakers, those who had these kind of notions and ideas that they wanted to project a new kind of reality to the masses, they were being financed by the film, by the government. And Ritwik Ghatak, we have already talked about that how he became a professor at FTII, who was a renowned filmmaker as well. Though Ghatak was not considered to be some sort of a great master in terms of film making earlier, but many of his films which were shown later in 1960s and 70s, they were considered to be a masterpiece, and his contribution to the Indian film industry was immense, was realized later, as was the case with Guru Dutt as well, that many of the films of Guru Dutt, they were not well received at the box office when they were released, but in 1970s and early 80s, when some of the people, those who were associated in terms of research of Guru Dutt's films, they realized that the kind of cinema which he made was quite ahead of its times when it was made, and the kind of experiment which he was doing with in terms of filmmaking, they were also quite unique. So these kind of things, they were seen during this particular period as well, as we see that Ghatak's film called Nagrik, which was some sort of a Bengali art film, and it was not being allowed to be released initially, and it was not allowed to be released, and it was later released in 1977. So all these kind of efforts, they were being made at this time, could be seen in the context that they also had some kind of impact as well, that these kind of films, they were these kind of financing by the government, this kind of establishing of various institutions by the government, it was some sort of a boost to the young filmmakers, those who wanted to present their film in a new film language. And at the same time, these kind of availability of finances, they made their task comparatively a bit easier, because they were not able to secure finance from the commercial filmmakers, those who were more interested in commercial filmmaking. They were not ready to produce that kind of cinema which was an alternative to the commercial cinema, which was seen to be some sort of a parallel cinema. So that was a help, and from that context more experimentation could be done in terms of making films. The kind of narratives which were made during this particular period, there was more scope in terms of the kind of themes which were chosen. There was more experimentation in the context of the films, how the films they were being presented to the audience. So these kind of changes were seen because of the fact that these kind of efforts were made in 1960s at the government level, and at the same time how Indian filmmakers, they were also watching world cinema as well. Films made by Akira Kurosawa, films made by neorealist filmmakers like Rossellini, De Sica, etc., and the French New Wave which was there in 1950s, in which we saw Godard and Truffaut. So all these kind of filmmakers, and how Indian filmmakers, they had their own ideas at the same time, and how they wanted to project their own ideas through their own language. So that was also seen during this particular period. Another important filmmaker which I would like to talk about is Mani Kaul, who was born in 1944 and who died in 2011, and he was also a graduate from FTII, Film and Television Institute of India, and he also was a student of Ritwik Ghatak. He was also a filmmaker who made a number of films as well, and at the same time he was also a teacher in film studies. He taught at various institutions in India and abroad the kind of intricacies which are associated with the film medium. He started his career with Usk Roti, which was made in 1969, and this film won him the Filmfare Critics Award for the best film. This film was recognized as the best film by the critics, and he also won the National Film Award for Best Direction for Duvida, which was made in 1974, and National Film Award for a documentary film called Siddheshwari, which he made in 1989. So what we see is that filmmakers, those who were associated with FTII, how one was Mani Kaul, another was Kumar Sahani, And these filmmakers like Mani Kaul and Kumar Sahani, the kind of films which they made in late 60s and early 70s, and how these films, they were trying to redefine cinema or the conventions which were associated with the film medium. They were trying to bring some kind of a novel and fresh perspective to the film medium. And Uski Roti, which I have talked about, was a film which was made in 1969. And Uski Roti was made in 1969, Our Daily Bread, A Day's Bread. You can see on the screen the kind of information which is being provided on Uski Roti, as it was based on a short story by Mohan Rakesh, who also wrote the dialogues for the film. It is considered to be one of the main films of new Indian cinema of late 60s and 70s. And how this film was a departure from the earlier Indian cinema techniques, the form and the narrative, how there was kind of change, and how the plot was dispensed altogether in the usual sense in the film. That plot was not all that important, rather the narrative or the film technique, it becomes more important. And it was considered to be the early formal experimental films in Indian cinema, in the context that it was experimental in nature as well, because this film was criticized on the ground that it was very slow in that context. The narrative was moving at a very slow speed, because the conventions of commercial cinema were such that films were comparatively more fast paced, and this film was not all that fast paced, which was not liked by many people, those who were used to seeing the commercial films. And that is why this film could not do much at the box office in that context, and it was criticized by the people, those who were more associated more with the commercial aspects of filmmaking. But Uski Roti was a path-breaking film in the context that it brought some sort of a fresh angle to the way the films they were being made in India, because in the film what we see is that not established actors which were associated with the commercial filmmaking, they were not used in the film. Dialogues, not many dialogues were there in the film, and even if dialogues were there, they were not all that dramatic, they were not dramatic in nature. And a lot of influence of Bresson, an important international filmmaker, Bresson, his influence could be seen. Cinematography was by K.K. Mahajan, who dwells on the faces, hands and exteriors, and a lot of emphasis is on hands, which is particularly Bressonian. And Mani Kaul in 1994, he himself says, I would like to quote him, "When I made A Day's Bread or Uski Roti, I wanted to completely destroy any semblance of a realistic development so that I could construct the film almost in the manner of a painter." So this kind of idea that he was trying to make a film in the manner of a painter, and any kind of realistic development, that kind of quality was to be was in a way intended by Mani Kaul, so that he could impart this kind of quality to the film. What we see is that the plot of the film deals with a truck driver and his wife, that every day the wife of the truck driver, she has to travel from the village to the main road where her husband would come every day, and she has to deliver the lunch or dinner, the kind of food which the food to that truck driver. And on one day when she gets late, she is not able to reach on time, husband becomes angry and he leaves. He does not wait for her, and when she reaches at the appointed place, she waits for the husband for a considerable period of time. So how that time goes on, and how the viewers they watched the film from that perspective, was central to the narrative. So, this was the basic plot on which film was based, and the people, those who were associated with the film, they were non-professionals, they were not all that professional actors, they were new to the film medium. So, how Money Call was trying to redefine cinema in that context could be seen in this particular film, and how the issue of the traditional or the patriarchal setup of the society could also be seen in this particular film. That because how husband, he is playing cards with his friends or spending time with his mistress, and he is coming once a week to his house. He is not a regular visitor to his house, and his wife is providing food to him every day, and how is he is expecting his wife to wait for him and to play a traditional role. And this is how the patriarchal setup of the Indian society is also reflected, that how in this film which was trying to project some sort of a narrative which was moving at a slower pace, but the conventions were also trying to project a kind of reality which was there in the Indian society, and that reality was showing that how a wife has to play some sort of a traditional role, and how wife, she has to adjust to the kind of whims and fancies of her husband, and the kind of patriarchal setup of the Indian society was also there. Another film which I would like to talk about was Ashad Ka Ek Din, which was made in 1971 by Money Call, and this was a film which was based on the debut Hindi play by Mohan Rakesh in 1958, and this play also received the Sangeet Natak Academy Award for the best play in 1959. So, on this play the film was based, Ashad Ka Ek Din by Money Call, and this film also received Filmfare Critics Award for the best film for the year. What we see is that before this play, when this was written, the earlier plays were either they were idealistic in nature or they were didactic in nature. They were trying to project some kind of an ideal, or they were didactic in the sense that they were trying to give some kind of a lesson on morality to the audience, and they were devoid of connection with contemporary reality, and their language was the language of the literature, which was not suitable for the stage. And this play was a complete departure from the earlier plays, and it changed the character of the earlier plays, in that sense that it brought some kind of freshness in terms of the language, in terms of the theme, in terms of the treatment. And how Money Call made a film on this play, which was associated with the life of Kalidas, a famous poet, Sanskrit poet, who lived around somewhere 100 BC and 400 AD. So, that was the period during the Gupta period. So how the life of Kalidas was shown in this film, and how Kalidas, who was living in a Himalayan village, and how he goes from his village to the court of Vikramaditya II of Ujjaini, and the kind of dilemma he has during this particular period, the kind of life which he had when he was living in the Himalayas, and the kind of changes which came in his life when he moves to the court, when he has to leave his lady love, and when he goes to the royal court, he marries there, and when he comes back after marrying a sophisticated lady to his village, and how his lady love, who was there when he left the village earlier, she has not married waiting for him. So, these kind of transformations which come in Kalidas' life during this particular period, how they are being projected in the film, they were quite new in terms of the treatment which was shown. Another film which I would like to talk about, as you can see on the screen, is Duvida, 1973-74, made by Money Call. It is some sort of a ghost film. The film is set in rural Rajasthan, and it is based on a story by Vijayadan Detha, as you can see on the screen, and which relates a popular folk tale from Rajasthan, in which a merchant's son, his relationship with the young bride is thwarted by his work, and a ghost who falls in love with her, in the resulting ghost impersonating the husband. So this film was later made by Amol Palekar also, with the title of Paheli in 2005, in which Shah Rukh Khan and Rani Mukherjee, they have played the central role. So same story was made by Money Call in 1973 with the title of Duvida, and the same story was given a different shade or a different twist by Amol Palekar in 2005. So this film, which was made with the title of Duvida by Money Call, the treatment was, in the context of narrative, was very fresh, and at the same time it also showed the landscape of Rajasthan, because the film was extensively shot in Jodhpur, in the village of Vijayadan Detha, with whose story the film was inspired. And at the same time, the music of the film was given by the folk musicians of Rajasthan, and these folk musicians of Rajasthan gave some kind of a regional kind of flavor to the film. So this film was also applauded at the national level, as Money Call got awards for this film called Duvida. Kumar Sahni was another important filmmaker who was born in 1940, and who also studied at FTII, Film and Television Institute of India. He was also a student of Ritwik Ghatak, and he made certain films. Maya Darpan was one in 1972 and Khayal Gatha in 1989. So what we see is that these kind of films which were made by Kumar Sahni, they were considered as some sort of a formalist film. Formalist film basically is a film which is focusing on the formal aspects, technical elements of a film, in which lightings, scoring, sound and set design, use of color, shot, composition and editing, all this is important in a formal film. So we will talk about Kumar Sahni and the films which he made tomorrow in the lecture, which we will continue on the parallel Hindi cinema. Till then, have a very good time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for the lecture, and of course you have already mentioned, you have told our viewers that we shall be back tomorrow talking more on this, which shall be part 2 of the same idea of parallel Hindi cinema. So this was it from us today. Thank you so much, sir, and thank you friends. Have a great day.